Dr. Lamley is a consultant pediatric cardiac anaesthetist at Great Ormond Street Hospital. He was convicted on the 4th of July 2022 at Lavender Hill Magistrates Court for using his wife's TfL pass to enter the ticket barriers at Hammersmith Underground Station on the 7th of February 2022 and admitted to using it on more than one occasion. He pleaded guilty to 55 offences in total, including the initial charge. The other journeys were taken between the 13th of December 2021 and the 4th of February 2022. Dr. Lamley was fined £500, ordered to pay compensation of £297, and costs. Dr. Lamley's wife received the concession pass in 2012, which entitled her to free travel on the TfL network. Dr. Lamley admitted to all the allegations in relation to his conviction in the tribunal hearing. The tribunal received oral evidence from Dr. Lamley and another pediatric anaesthetist, who testified on behalf of Dr. Lamley. The tribunal also had access to documentary evidence, including transport for London schedule, a certificate of conviction, Dr. Lamley's witness statement, his curriculum vitae, a reflective statement he sent to the GMC, an attendance certificate for a mindfulness course he took in June 2022, and a bundle of testimonials and character references. The testimonials provided by 9 of Dr. Lamley's work colleagues who were aware of his offending behavior were all positive, describing him as a respected, hard-working, and honest clinician. The counsel representing the GMC argued that the tribunal should consider the statutory overarching objective, which aims to protect the public, promote public confidence in the medical profession, and maintain professional standards. While the doctor's actions did not pose a risk to patient safety, a finding of impairment is necessary to meet the second and third limbs of the objective and to maintain public confidence and professional standards. The counsel submitted that the case involves a criminal conviction for fraudulent use of a pass, which is a significant breach of good medical practice. The GMC considers allegations of dishonesty to be serious and has guidance for decision-makers in such cases. Dr. Lamley's repeated dishonesty was for financial benefit and undermines public trust and confidence in the medical profession. The GMC believes that evidence of clinical competence cannot mitigate serious and/or persistent dishonesty. The counsel argued that insight is an important factor for the tribunal to consider at the impairment stage, and that Dr. Lamley's reflection on his conviction and counseling sessions should be taken into account. However, she pointed out that Dr. Lamley's reasoning for his offences, such as using the pandemic as a context for sympathy, does not fully apply as the offences took place well outside of the pandemic or any lockdown. She also highlighted that Dr. Lamley's misuse of the concession pass was not solely for NHS work, as some journeys were for privately paid work. The counsel invited the tribunal to consider how Dr. Lamley's colleagues and the public would perceive his offences, and that his prior personal and work-related stress may not fully explain his actions. The GMC submitted that Dr. Lamley has attempted remediation by undertaking CPD training in professional ethics and a course in mindfulness. However, according to Young v. GMC, evidence of remediation is of less importance when there is a breach of fundamental tenets of the profession, such as dishonesty. Testimonial evidence and character references show that Dr. Lamley is valued and respected by his peers, but evidence of clinical competence cannot mitigate serious and/or persistent dishonesty according to paragraph 124 of the Sanctions guidance. The representative for the General Medical Council argued that maintaining public confidence and professional standards is crucial, and that there is a risk of undermining public confidence if Dr. Lamley is not found impaired. Dishonesty is viewed as a serious attitudinal concern, and evidence of remediation is less significant in cases of persistent dishonesty. The counsel referred to previous cases that demonstrate a strict line is taken in relation to findings of dishonesty. A finding of impairment is required to uphold probity as a fundamental tenet of the profession and to show that criminal conduct brings the profession into dispute, and that dishonesty is a very serious breach of the profession. The representative invited the tribunal to consider the case of GMC v. Armstrong, 2021, when considering the question of dishonesty. The counsel for the doctor referred to several legal authorities, including the case of Professional Standards Authority for Health and Social Care v. General Medical Council, Pavan Kwa Opal. He invited the tribunal to find that Dr. Lamley's fitness to practice was not impaired and to consider his insight and remediation, as well as the character references provided in his support. The counsel argued that the criminal offence committed by Dr. Lamley was at the lower end of criminal culpability and that it was a course of dishonest conduct rather than separate individual occasions. He also submitted that Dr. Lamley unreservedly accepts that his actions were wrong and that he has shown good insight and remediation. The counsel invited the tribunal to reject the GMC's submission that Dr. Lamley does not have sufficient insight into his offending and highlighted some positive testimonials provided in support of Dr. Lamley. He suggested that the tribunal exercise caution in considering the case of Yeung, and referred to the case of CHRE versus Grant. Finally, the counsel submitted that it was open to the tribunal to find Dr. Lamley's fitness to practice not impaired and to issue a warning. The tribunal has considered whether Dr. Lamley's ability to practice is impaired due to his conviction and has applied a two-stage test. The tribunal has concluded that the first stage of the test is met as Dr. Lamley has been convicted of a criminal offense. The tribunal considered Dr. Lamley's conviction to be serious as he had used his wife's concession pass 55 times, which involved deception and sustained dishonesty over 3 months. The tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley's conduct amounted to serious and persistent failures to adhere to the paragraphs of GMP related to being a good doctor, establishing patient trust, and acting with integrity and within the law. The tribunal then applied the test in Grant to determine whether Dr. Lamley's fitness to practice is impaired, and found that his conduct had brought the medical profession into disrepute and breached one of the fundamental tenets of the medical profession by acting dishonestly. The tribunal looked at the evidence of insight and remediation, the likelihood of repetition, and balanced these against the statutory overarching objective to determine whether a finding of current impairment of fitness to practice is necessary. The tribunal considered Dr. Lamley's insight into his behavior which led to the conviction. The tribunal noted that Dr. Lamley has shown some insight by pleading guilty to the offenses at an early stage and making full admissions. He has also apologized for his actions and shown remorse. Dr. Lamley has attended a mindfulness course and an ethics course during which he has explored aspects of his offending behavior in individual and group sessions which have given him more opportunities to reflect on his conduct. The tribunal considered that his insight continues to develop into underlying reasons for his behavior. Dr. Lamley has set out his personal account of events in a reflective statement submitted to the tribunal, in which he stated that he began using his wife's concession pass intermittently for his own travel to work during the nationwide lockdown that began in March 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. He felt stressed and isolated on a daily basis at that time, often being the only passenger on an entire underground train. He admitted that he rationalized using his wife's concession pass as a result of a mixture of stress, fatigue and a sense of injustice of having to pay to go to work during a pandemic. The tribunal has taken into account Dr. Lamley's previous good character and the views of several of his colleagues who have worked with him for some time and who know him well. The tribunal has also considered the role of the different stress factors outlined by Dr. Lamley on his actions and his culpability, and taken account of its obligations under the Equality Act 2010. The tribunal accepted that Dr. Lamley would have been under increased stress at times during the period of his offending and understood why he might have resented having to go to work given he was working on the front line and putting himself at risk at a time when whole world is in lockdown and there were no vaccines available. However, the tribunal considered that Dr. Lamley conflated his stress during the early stages of the pandemic to excuse the entire period of his offending. The tribunal was therefore unable to accept Dr. Lamley's explanation for his actions. The MPT considered the remediation undertaken by Dr. Lamley, who had been convicted of dishonesty. The GMC argued that dishonesty is difficult to remediate, but Dr. Lamley had completed mindfulness and ethics courses, reflected on his actions, and provided a reflective statement and oral evidence to the tribunal. The tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley had made considerable efforts to remediate his behavior. The tribunal determined that the risk of repetition by Dr. Lamley is very low given his level of insight and remediation. Dr. Lamley has put coping mechanisms in place such as meditation and mindfulness, which mitigate the risk of repeating the criminal behavior. The role of Dr. Lamley's work colleagues, peers, and supervisors was also considered, as they are likely to be part of the checks and balances to help him avoid repetition of his behavior. Dr. Lamley is also continuing to explore the reasons for his offending behavior. The tribunal considered whether a finding of current impairment of fitness to practice was necessary in Dr. Lamley's case, balancing his level of insight, remediation, and likelihood of repetition against the statutory overarching objective. The two limbs engaged were the need to maintain public confidence and the need to uphold proper professional standards. The tribunal concluded that a finding of impairment was necessary to promote and maintain public confidence in the medical profession and proper professional standards and conduct. Dr. Lamley's case was not exceptional enough to justify a finding of no impairment, as it involves several offenses committed over several months with financial gain and deception involved.
The tribunal considered the aggravating and mitigating factors when determining the appropriate sanction for Dr. Lamley. The tribunal considered Dr. Lamley's conviction for fare evasion, which involved the fraudulent use of a concession pass, and how it brought the medical profession into disrepute. The aggravating factors identified included Dr. Lamley's persistent dishonesty, the financial benefit he gained from the offense, and the impact on public trust in the medical profession. The mitigating factors identified were Dr. Lamley's admission of guilt, his apology, and his participation in mindfulness and ethics courses. The tribunal first considered taking no action but determined that the serious nature of Dr. Lamley's conviction required action to uphold public confidence in the medical profession. The tribunal then considered whether undertakings or conditions would be appropriate sanctions but concluded that they were not suitable in this case. The tribunal determined that an order of conditions would not mark the seriousness of its finding. The tribunal considered whether a suspension was an appropriate sanction for Dr. Lamley. It referred to several provisions of the SG, including paragraphs 91, 92, 93, and 97A, E, F, and G. The tribunal found that suspension has a deterrent effect and can be used to send a signal to the doctor, the profession, and the public about behavior unbefitting a registered doctor. Suspension is appropriate when the misconduct is serious and necessary to protect the public and maintain public confidence in the profession. The tribunal found that Dr. Lamley admitted his conduct at an early stage of both the criminal and regulatory proceedings and had shown genuine remorse. He had accepted responsibility for his actions and continued to develop insight. He had reflected on the tribunal's determination at the impairment stage, and this had contributed to his insight into his actions. He had acknowledged to his counsel that his actions were shameful. The tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley had taken significant steps towards remediation, and the risk of repetition was low. The tribunal also considered the seriousness of Dr. Lamley's behavior. However, the tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley's conduct was not fundamentally incompatible with his continued registration. The tribunal considered the wider public interest and sought to balance Dr. Lamley's interests against the wider public interest in this case. The tribunal found that any sanction lower than a suspension, in this case, would not be sufficient to protect the public or maintain confidence in doctors. The tribunal noted that there was no evidence demonstrating that remediation was unlikely to be successful. Dr. Lamley continues to develop insight, and the offending took place after Dr. Lamley had undergone certain treatment. There has been no evidence of repetition of similar behavior since February 2022. The tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley had some insight into his behavior, and he did not pose a significant risk of repeating the type of behavior that brought him before the tribunal. The tribunal considered and balanced the mitigating factors presented by Dr. Lamley against the central aim of sanctions. While Dr. Lamley had breached GMP, his actions were not fundamentally incompatible with continued registration. Therefore, the tribunal found that a suspension was an appropriate sanction. The tribunal considered the factors set out in paragraphs 99 and 100 of the SG. The tribunal determined that Dr. Lamley's case was serious, but did not involve any risk to patient safety or public protection. The tribunal considered the aggravating and mitigating factors and directed itself to ensure that Dr. Lamley had adequate time to remediate. The tribunal decided to suspend Dr. Lamley's registration for 6 months, which it determined was the shortest period consistent with marking the conduct as unacceptable. The tribunal considered erasure would be disproportionate in this case. The tribunal did not direct a review hearing in Dr. Lamley's case as it concluded that it would have no added value.